There are several things that have to happen in the GET version of the index action method, this one right here. This is the one that responds to the initial request for the page, as opposed to the request to execute a report. So first I have to retrieve the app settings and put them in the report view model. I have to instantiate a connection to the management web service and provide some appropriate security credentials. I need to get a list of the reports in the sample reports folder and get a list of the render formats available on the server. All right, so let's add the code that accomplishes those steps. First thing I need to do is add a few using statements. I'm going to be using the configuration namespace in order to read the app settings section of web.config. So I'll add a using statement to system.configuration. Next, I want to add references or using statements to my web services objects, to the web references. Now, if I come over here to Solution Explorer, the names that I gave them were fairly verbose because I wanted to identify. If I come back 6 months from now, look at these web references, I want to have some sort of a clue of what each of these is without delving down into the code and trying to find a comment that identifies what it is. So I named it RS Execution Web Reference and RS Management Web Reference. Kind of long names, they identify what they are, but pretty tedious to keep typing over and over again in my code. So I'm going to use an alias form of a using statement. Type using and say RSMGT, a shorthand name. This is going to be the name that I use within my code, and set that equal to reportrunner.rs management web reference. So now, instead of using reportrunner.rs management web reference, or even just rs management web reference, I can just use rs management. And I'll do the same for rs exec. Okay, so that'll save me a few keystrokes over the course of writing the application. All right, so let's start writing some code for this. I'm going to need that return statement a little bit later, so I'll go ahead and leave it in and modify it a bit. I'm going to do Control-KD to kind of organize this a little bit better for my tab settings. All right, first thing I need to do is instantiate that report view model. Whoops. Helps to select the right one. And I'm going to call that RVM. And that's going to new up a new instance of that object. Okay, so that's going to make it available for me to send to the view. And now I need to populate a couple of those properties with values from app settings. So I'm going to use that RVM and set report server, that property of that model. And I'll use the configuration manager and the app settings property in order to get access to the report server setting. And then do the same thing with report folder, configuration manager, app settings, and do report folder. Okay, so when this code executes, those two properties of the view model will have those settings that I put in web.config. Now it's time to instantiate a connection to the management web service. And for that, I'm going to use the reporting service 2010 object that was created by the web server proxy. And then I also need to set the credentials for it. So I'll use rs management again. And access that object. You can see it's right there. Whoops. Reporting service 2010. And I'm going to call that variable rs. And I'm just going to new up an instance of that object. Okay, the object is now in memory and available for me to use and set properties to. And now I need to set the credentials that are going to be used for the access. In this particular case, I'm going to set it to the credentials of the Windows user who is running this application on the local machine. That works for this sample application because I'm running it on a local machine. It's accessing the local machine. I have access under my Windows credentials to the reporting services. All is well and good, and I don't need to deal with security issues. In different environments, you would need to do something different. provide username and password, provide some other impersonation, other things. So what you do there, the myriad ways that things you might have to do to provide the credentials, so you need to customize it for your security environment. But in this case, all I need to do is use that RS object, specify credentials, and then use the system.net.credential cache and the default credentials, and that will pass to that property my Windows credentials. And again, because I have permissions to access the report server, I'm good and I can access it. So you're pretty much always going to need to take that step. Instantiate that reporting service 2010 and then give it some sort of credentials. All right, long last, it's finally time to retrieve the list of reports from the report server. So I'm going to use a generic list collection to collect together, to gather all of the names of the reports, because all I need is the string name of the report. That's all I need to later execute it. It's going to implement a list, and this is going to contain strings, so I'll use a type string, and I'll call that reports, and I'll new up that object. Okay, so that instantiates that list object and gets it ready to hold all of these. Now I need to get a collection of the catalog items that are reports. And the way I do that is I access the management web service, so I'll use RS management, and then I'll use catalog item because I'm going to get back an array of catalog items that then I can treat as a collection and loop through to get all of the reports. So I'll name that items, because this actually isn't going to retrieve just reports. It can retrieve other things that are within the specified folder. So this isn't yet reports, so I'm going to call it items. Besides the fact that calling it reports here would conflict with that reports right there. Okay, so items, and so this is going to equal RS, and I'm going to use the list children, that method, in order to get a list of the reports. Now I need to pass to it the location on the server where those reports are coming from. In this case, I want them to come from the report folder that is going to be, that I've set within app settings, that sample reports folder. And so I'm essentially just reading this property right there from the report view model. And then I want to tell it not to recurse into any subfolders. I could if I wanted to, in which case it would return all items from the sample reports on down, however many subfolders and sub-subfolders and so on there might be. But in this case, I know there's no subfolders. If there were, I didn't want any other items to come from there. So I'm just going to pass false and be done with it. Okay, so now items is going to have a collection of all of the items within that folder. Now I can do a for each loop, and I'm going to access these as RS management catalog items. Oops. Okay, IntelliSense is, okay, well, I'll type it in and hopefully I don't have some problem that I'm working with here. Catalog item, that looks good. And I'll call this item in items. Okay, I'm not sure why IntelliSense wasn't seeing that. Maybe I'll go ahead and build the project just to make sure it's seeing everything. That'll make it a little bit easier. Generally don't need to do that. Okay. Oh, that's why. Okay. So not all paths, I'm in a for each loop. Okay, so I'm sort of in a temporary situation where I have a syntactical error because I have a for each and it's not seeing a return in the for each. Although I'm kind of surprised. That shouldn't be causing problems with IntelliSense, but I'll just run with it. Okay, so for each loop, I'm going to loop through each of these items. And what I want to do is check to see if the particular item is a report. So I'm going to have an if statement, and I'm going to say if item dot type name, this is a string property, is report. Because that folder could have data sources, data sets, other artifacts within it. I happen to know it doesn't, but this is a nice way to make sure that I'm only getting reports. And then I'm going to then, if it is a report, add this to that generic list item that is just a list of strings, and add the item.name. And so now, when that line of code executes, that's going to add that report item to that set of reports. Okay, so after this, I have the set of reports in that list item, and now I need to create the select list in order to put that in a form that the view has a very easy time to display as a drop-down list. And I'm going to assign that to the reports property of the report view model. So I'm going to use the report view model dot reports, and I'll new up a select list and pass it reports. Okay, so now the view model has the list of reports, and it's good to go. Now I need to do a similar thing in order to retrieve the set of render extensions that are supported on this particular report server. Now the code's going to be a little bit more complex because I want to filter the results a little bit more rigorously, because I'm going to get some extraneous results if I just use the complete set of extensions. There's some extensions that really aren't directly usable from a user application like this. All right, so I'm going to use the same overall flow of code. I'm going to use the generic list item in order to collect the different render extensions that I want to include in the drop-down list. But here's where I'm going to use that models.render format. So that's that custom model that I created that provides a couple of properties that make it real easy to provide both the value and the display for each of the formats. Okay, so I'm going to have a generic list of the render format objects, and I'll name this formats, and I'll new up an instance of that generic list object. Okay, next step, I need to use the web service, the management service, in order to get a list of extension items. And this is going to return an array of extension items, so I'll create an array there. And I'll call this extensions. Strictly speaking, it's not a rendering format yet because this is going to be a lot of extensions. As I mentioned, there's some additional things that I really don't want to include in the drop-down list. All right, I'll set that equal to rs, and I'll use the list extensions. That's a method of the web service in order to retrieve these. And in this case, I want the render extensions. And even filtering them with that keyword, I get a few that I don't want, that I really can't use. So I still need to later filter them. But this is going to at least narrow down what I get back from the server. And it's always good to reduce what you bring across the network. Okay, so now extensions has a collection of all the extension objects. And so once again, I want to use a for each loop. And this time I'm going to use an rs management rs. Fingers aren't working very well. And this is going to be an extension. And that actually needs to be capitalized. Okay. Should be fine. Okay. Okay, so this is going to be an extension. I'll just call it extension in that set of extensions. Okay, so I'm just looping through that collection that I got. See, here's where I need to further filter that list. So I'm going to do if extension is visible. So this, as near as I can tell, this is something that reporting services uses to indicate whether or not the extension should be displayed in that export drop-down list that you see in Report Manager. But it's handy for our applications. So I want to check to see if it's visible and set that equal to true. But I also want to include it if the name of the extension is HTML 4.0. Because oddly enough, this is not one of the visible extensions. And again, I think the reason for that is that that export button in Report Manager doesn't display HTML as the export format because you're already looking at the report as HTML. So it'd be kind of redundant to let the user take an HTML report and display it as HTML. Okay, so, but for our purposes, I want it to either be visible or HTML. If it is, then I want to add it to that set of formats. Add method. And in this case, I'm going to new up a render format. And set the localized name to the extension .localized name, and the format name to the extension name. And I'll break those two, make it easier to see. And it goes ahead and format for me anyway. Okay, so this creates that render format object, and I'm adding that to the formats. So again, this is an easy and convenient way for me to communicate from the controller to the view. All right, so that's all I need to do within the loop. So once the loop is done, it's looped through all of the extensions here and added this new render format object with the localized name and the name. So this formats collection has a list of all of the render formats. I need to now create that select list object and assign it to the report view model formats property. So I'll again do a new select list and pass in the formats. But I also want to sort the list. It comes from reporting services in no particular order, or what seems to be a random order. So I'm going to use a link expression, actually a link expression method, called order by, in order to sort them. And the way I do that is that these are formats, so I'll just call my variable f, and specify that I want to sort on the localized name. So this is going to result in a list that is sorted by the names that the user is seeing. So it makes it easy for the user to find what they want. Okay, and then I need to continue defining the select list. So I'm going to specify that the format name is the selected value. So that's the value that is going to be returned to me, to the HTTP post action method, in order to identify the user selection. But then I want to use localized name there as the name that is displayed to the user. Okay, so this is the display name. And then furthermore, I want to specify that the HTML 4.0 option in the list is the default value. Okay, so let me put a page break there and a semicolon, and there you can see that code. Okay, so again, it's newing up a select list. It's going to sort formats by that localized name. It's going to use the format name as the value and the localized name to display to the user, and HTML4 is going to be the default selection. Notice that when I created the select list for the reports, I didn't do any of that. Turns out that it's going to return the reports in alphabetical order. I don't know for sure that that's something that we can rely on, but it works now, so I kept the code simple. But you could sort it by report name as well. And then I also just left it so the default value is the first report in the list. So you can do different things with that select value. Okay, so that's the code that I need within this controller with one exception. I'm going to delete a couple lines here. The last thing I need to do is modify this stock return method because I need to pass the report view model to the view. So I'm just going to pass in that RVM. All right, so that's that index action method that is going to display the page to the user. It's not going to execute the report. I haven't done that code yet. Now I need to come over to the index view and change this up a little bit in order to display the drop-down list and then fix up some of the navigation stuff down here. Because all I have at this point is it's just displaying those two properties of that report view model. Notice that it didn't even try to display the other two properties because it didn't know what I wanted to do with those render list items. So let's come down here and I'm just going to blow away this entire last element. And I'm going to add some stuff down here. Because what I want to do is create a form with the report and format drop-down lists, as well as submit buttons to display the report using either a custom URL or web service calls using that execution web service. Okay, so I'm going to add an H4 here for the header, and I'll tell the user to select report and format. And then I'm going to create the form using Razor technology. So I'm going to begin the form, which is going to render that opening form element. I don't need to pass any parameters to it. And then I'm going to display the drop-down lists in a table. Scroll down here a bit. All right, so I'll do a table row and then a table cell. And the first thing I'll put in is report. And then I'll keep this fairly simple, add a colon and do TD and another opening TD. And put in this drop-down list. I'll keep it a little bit more formatted. What the heck? Okay, and so here what I want to do is I want to use the HTML helper method called drop-down list, and I pass the name that it's going to be given. This is going to be the name of the select element that's going to be rendered out to the web page. I'm going to call this report because that's the name that I'm going to use in the action method in the controller that responds to the postback in order to extract which report the user selected. All right, so that's the name of the element. And then here I'm going to use model.reports. So that's going to retrieve that collection of strings, and I'm going to cast that as a select list. Because if I just use model.reports, that's a dynamic property of the model, and so it's just going to return an object. So I need to cast it as a select list. And that's a nice compact format for doing that. Okay, so there I have my first drop-down list. And now I need to do the same thing to save you the pain of watching me type all that again. I'm going to copy this and change this to format. And here I want to name the element format. Consistent naming is always good. And here I want to use the formats selection. Okay, so that's the code that is going to display those drop-down list boxes. Now, still within that form, I also need to include the buttons. So I'm going to do a little paragraph tag here with a non-breaking space. And then do another one. And include that first button. So these are going to be input buttons. Oops. I'll include ID value as well. And then the value that I want to display on the button, and value that I'm going to use within my code to determine which button was pressed. For this first one is going to be view report by custom URL. Okay, so that's my first button. And I'll once again copy that. Button still named the same thing, but the value is going to be View Report by Web Service. And I'll save my changes. All right, so assuming that I've done everything correctly, we now have a working application. So I'll go ahead and fire it up. That should load Internet Explorer, compiling the application, of course. It's going to the home and the index action method, which is the default. And it's waiting for reporting services to wake up. All right, so we have an unhandled exception. Additional information, data binding, report runner models.render format does not contain a property with the name localized name. That is a typo. It should be localized name. Okay, let's go back over here. And so the actual location of the problem isn't right here. Let me go into Home Controller, and I used localized name there. Localized name, localized name. So if I come back over here to Solution Explorer, let me stop execution. Come over here to Solution Explorer and go into my models. Localized name. That looks right. Okay, so someplace I used it. Must have been in the view. It's not there. Okay, some debugging here. F.localized name. Oh, right there. Okay, the one place, it figures, the one place where I don't get syntax checking. That should have been the first place I looked. Okay, so I was telling the select list to use localize name as the name of the property, but it's called localized, so that was the problem. All right, let's try again. Always glad for happy endings. Again, waiting for localhost and reporting services, and we have the page. And best of all, we have the report drop-down list box populated with all of the reports in that sample reports folder that I'm using, as well as all of the valid formats, and HTML4 is the default. And they're in alphabetical order. Okay, so that's what we had to do in order to display this initial page to the user. Now, it doesn't currently do anything. I can click on that all day. It's just going to redirect to the same page because I haven't written any code for that yet. And notice too that it's a relatively ugly item. It's using a default layout, default styling for the application, but you can certainly go out, define your own _layout.cshtml file in order to improve the overall appearance of it. But this is not a design course, so I'm just going to leave it ugly and focus on the code, which is the cool part.